But this is a guy that flew the hump in World War II, Burma, over the top to Kunming, China. Half of them didn't make it. These all overloaded planes and stuff. And he enlisted way early, 1941. He was in it all the way. And I hope we remember him for that as much as anything. I was in the U.S. Congress gallery the night the Magnuson Act passed, and he was the one that was close enough to Warren Magnuson that Alaska was protected with a one-vote majority instead of being stripped like the rest of America was stripped us back in our colonial days. You know, he's had a full life. There's not a complaint, and he died the way he'd like to be. You know, go in an airplane. He was a flyer all his life. He wasn't at the controls, of course. But you know, those of us of the World War II generation, there, you know, when one goes, it's a big vacancy. A white Republican in Washington, D.C., you know, Jesus Christ would have been convicted. There wasn't any way he could get out. Mm-hmm. The deck was stacked. They were going to give a guilty verdict regardless of the stuff. And then what they did covering up the good information. Bill Allen was a sleaze. He shouldn't have let him get that close. He was railroaded, and it's a crime. And I'm ashamed that the Alaskans didn't stay with him. The very people that he hoped the most were the ones that dumped him. I'm ashamed of him. When I was talking to him, I was talking about issues that had to do with the fisheries at my wife's funeral here on the 1st of June. And he was very positive on what we ought to do, and we were arguing a little bit about it. We weren't always on the same side on some of these issues. And, but, you know, he was very positive. You know, he said, I can't even get into it now for another year. You know, I have to stay out of it. It's over, but he wasn't about to give up the fight.
Stay out of it for another year, what do you mean?
He wasn't allowed to lobby or to represent us. You know, I went to him and said, Ted, you know, I represent the Aleutian Island natives. We need your hand on a couple of issues. It's not that Begish wouldn't be with us too. He just didn't have the power that Ted did. As far as I'm concerned, fish have no party. It's one of the things that we've done the best in the state of Alaska we can be proud of. He said, I'll never run again. He said, once you're out, and you can't pick up and start over again. He said, there's other things I have to do, and I'm going to do them. So I think that he was out to push things, all sorts of things, like the pipeline. Mm-hmm. He believed in the one that had to be in Alaska, and he'd have utilized Alaskan money. Nobody's irreplaceable, but I'd say we'll be treated more like a colony and less like a state. You know, it takes years to get the power he had. His connections to Byrd and Inouye and, you know, Fritz Hollings back in those, they didn't have anything to do with party. They were buddies, and as they used to say after the Civil War, they'd seen the elephant. You know, they were guys that had come up the hard way, and they were friends. And it takes a lifetime to develop that. Are we poorer because he passed on? Yes, he was still doing good things for Alaska. And I don't think it made any difference which administration. Ted always worked well. No matter whether you like the Alaska land claims or not, it gave the natives a fighting chance. If they mess it up, it's their fault. But he gave them even ground. Life gives you that. You know, you're on a conveyor belt, and if you live a full life before you drop off the end, you're lucky. And he had a full life. I would have liked to have him have another 10 years, because there's things I'd like to talk about that he could do. You know, he was still a power back then. And Ted was a fire eater as a young man. and we collided a lot of times. But I'd say as his children grew and his grandchildren grew, he spent more time thinking of what kind of a state or territory will I be leaving for my children. And so maybe the Romans were right in not allowing anyone to run for the Senate that was under 60. You had to be 60 years old to run for the Roman Senate. Maybe it's better to have the grandfathers there. I know it's better to have the grandmothers there. But his argument was that if the federal government was not going to let us use the land and they controlled 90% of it, they ought to pay 90% of the bill. And his arguments were valid enough for it to win in Washington. He understood that if you take a man's land, you've taken his life. Now there's the urban natives that will just disappear into the woodwork in time, as we'll all be kind of mixed. Some of my grandchildren are part native, that just all gonna. But the ones that actually live on the land should own it. This was their land, and they should have a place in it. Just because they thought different. I work for the Aleuts, and the standing joke is it's more dangerous to have an Aleut for a friend than an enemy. Because we don't always understand what the other's thinking. But I know my commitment is what my government did to them in World War II. And I was so ashamed of it. While I'm a quarter Mohawk, I'm not ashamed of the fact of what my people did to the Mohawk. They put a bounty on their scalp. But they'd said we're the British. They weren't on my side. And therefore, they had no rights when you lost. But once you've signed an agreement and they're American citizens and you don't treat them as American citizens, that's a disgrace. It's like what we did to the Japanese in World War II. Or what Andrew Jackson did to the Cherokees. Sam Houston and Davy Crockett both left over that. I admire Davy. They think of Davy Crockett in the coonskin cap. I think of him in the debates there on the floor of the U.S. Congress saying you can't take their land from them. George Washington gave them that deed. You do not have the right. But they were the greedy. And Stevens wasn't one of the greedy.